So in 2012, the 82nd had been really come in to really secure one part and help our last kind of big advance. So we had been sent to Ghazni province. Very select part of Afghanistan. It's got some mountains, but one of the big things that we were really working on was really securing one highway, which was Highway 1, which led from Kandahar Airfield all the way up to kind of the northern part, which was Bagram Airfield in Kabul, the capital at the time. So we were really coming back in and trying to take that back from the Taliban at the time. So we landed boots and snow. Most conventional forces that come into Afghanistan, you kind of get like a week orientation. You land, you kind of get the, hey, these are the do's and don'ts. You kind of get respun up on like, hey, these are what the newest mines are looking like. This is what's happening. You're kind of getting a refresher course before you really get thrown out into the thing. So I landed. I was in a small little outpost that had just been put in place, and the Polish at the time was the force that we were actually taking over for. So we landed, and I remember we landed in these Chinooks out in what we call HLZ, or helicopter landing zone. We landed. It's like 10 degrees outside, and we step in the snow, and you just sink. And the Polish guy comes out and he's like, hey, you might as well just take your boots off and lace them around, because like you're going to be up to mud and snow up to your knees. There's no reason just to like get your boots wet. And I remember that was like the first like point. I'm like, oh crap. Like, all right, cool. This is going to be an interesting few months. And I thought that was a really interesting thing, is like kind of coming into Afghanistan. Like, one, the first people that like outside of me meeting Americans and things we were meeting our partner forces that were there kind of in the fight. So the Polish had kind of really been responsible for that area. So we got all of our bags, we got them loaded, we kind of walked our spots, we kind of were starting to figure out things there. And I was part of the advanced party. Most military movements will have like an advanced party that's got a very specialized like group of people, whether it's like your IT guys or your leaders. They're really there to kind of help orchestrate the larger forces coming in to make sure everything's kind of prepped and ready. So I was part of that advanced force, kind of making sure everything was set up, everything like phones, computers, making sure like that everybody could talk and stuff like that. But I remember kind of coming in, and this is a memory that I'll never forget, is, coming in, we were there, I was there for like 4 or 5 days, hadn't heard any gunshots, hadn't heard like any rockets or anything. It was like so crazy. I was like, man, it's so quiet. Like our intel briefing said, like expect like for us to get rocketed a lot and all these things. So we were talking to our Polish counterparts, and they're like, yeah, we don't get rocketed anymore. I'm like, we were like, anymore? They're like, yeah, well, we don't fire back at them. Like we just go on. We're here to kind of like, just drive around, and we don't really pick a fight. We're here. And this was a really mind-blowing concept for a lot of us Americans, right? Like we're like, what? Like you're here to fight. Like, what are you talking about? So we kind of get in place, we get our stuff set up, and then finally about 30 days in, we're really starting to go out on patrol, starting to try to really take over and understand things. And at that time, so one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is anytime you go fight against another nation, they have intel just like we do. So a lot of the things that makes the American warfighter capable is the intel that's given, and we act upon that intel. We try to make good collective decisions. We don't try to get into bad fights whenever we can help it. But the military, or the local kind of Taliban there, could look at an army patch and know, hey, who is coming in? They could say like, hey, so the unit that I was with, the 82nd, it's 2As. Since we're all Americans, they know the patch, but they also know kind of like what that unit's going to bring. And the one thing that I love about the 82nd is that from a conventional unit, and you'll hear me say conventional and unconventional because I spent time in the conventional forces of the military. That's what you see every day. And I also spent time on the special operations side, the unconventional approach. But the Taliban knew kind of the patch that was coming in. They knew what kind of fight was coming. They knew that, hey, every time that there's been big conflicts in Afghanistan, the 82nd's been at that forefront of helping push that fight. So we noticed very quickly after our first day of being out, of sending troops outside the wire, really starting to do some like figuring out the community and things like that, we started taking rockets. And the Polish, their eyes got big, and they're like, we noticed their timeline had spun up a ton. They're like, hey, we're ready to get out. Like, hey, let's hand this over to the Americans. They apparently are ready to pick a fight. We had done that, though. We were just kind of doing our jobs there. And I thought that was a really like quick awakening to understand like America's temperament to how we fight wars. When we come, we try to fight on front where we have intelligence. We make those calculated decisions, but people know, countries know, like when certain people get there at certain times, what's coming and like what's that there. And I think uh, that's laid forth by the warriors and the people and the paratroopers that were before me, everything from Afghanistan and all the other prior conflicts all the way out to WW2 where, the division made its name. And I think that was a very unique kind of time period. And over those like few months that I spent there, and I kind of got a chance to hop around all of Afghanistan in my first deployment, I got to see a different take of Afghanistan. People were just trying to be, living their lives, but at the same time, there's a war being fought around them. And one of the things, so it's a fun memory. I was talking to the family about is, I got in country that time, and I hadn't taken my first shower like most people in Afghanistan at that time. When you're out in the super outpost, like you live off of a wall, like just like a regular like water ball. And that's what you take your showers with if you get lucky. Thankfully, in the winter you're not sweating as much, so it's a little bit. But I don't think I took my first shower. It's like I was at least like I'd say probably like 50 or 60 days in until I took my first like real shower. And it was a cold shower too. We got there, like they were like, yeah, they have no hot water. You get a cold shower though. And we're like, you kind of debate whether you want to take a shower or not because it's like 14 degrees outside. So you don't know if it's worth it to take a cold shower. But during that time, I think it was a very different approach because like only the only training that I had like to understand like the local populace and around there was kind of what had been like taught to us as we were getting prepared for Afghanistan. And in 2012, like you were deploying with people that had multiple deployments. The deployment cycle started off early in the war with like people taking 15-month deployments, then 12-month deployments, then 9-month deployments. Like you only get your experiences from those around you that had been deployed before. So I think my earliest like recognition of like getting into Afghanistan was one, understanding like our heavy reliance on coalition forces and kind of understanding the difference in that and what it means sometimes for that American warfighter coming in. Because I remember there was days, hands down, I think the deadliest day that we had out at that outpost, I think we took close to 40 different or 40 rockets and mortars in succession, meaning that like, hey, we were getting hit like mortars and rockets coming in nonstop for a few minutes. And you're really just like thinking about like kind of where you're living. You're not really in these big protected buildings or anything. We're living in draped tents with some sandbags set up around something. So if a mortar comes in over top of your tent, it's just not your day. And I think that was like a time period where, everybody has a different story on that and what that kind of brought for them. So like there was a really different temperament kind of coming into Afghanistan, but we were that, hey, we're still here to fight. We're here for a reason. So the days that we would get rocketed and things like that were also the days that we'd fight back so hard. I can remember that day that we hands down was our worst. I mean, like over that day, we'd probably been hit like 40 times probably. And after we got hit and we did our battle assessment and we treated the wounded and we made sure people were getting evac'd out that had been hit or some of the people that we had lost. The very next thing was we were going in and getting intelligence, like who attacked us. We're going back out. We're trying to ensure kind of like that we're one, making sure this doesn't happen again to us. But we're really trying to root that out. And I think that was like my first like big point of understanding like, hey, this is a whole different place. This is a whole different like community. And I think it was a very distinct thing that was hard for me to like kind of wrap my head around at first. And it's something like talking to people was everybody has this understanding of like war and like people that haven't deployed, they have this understanding of war. Like you know who you're fighting, they're properly identified. There's no like crazy things, but like a lot of the attacks that we were getting hit with were people that would stand outside of a school with children and they would launch a mortar right beside that school, right at American forces, knowing that American forces would not fire back on the school. That like, hey, we are going to make the right decision. We're not going to do that. So for us to be able to make that decision, now we have to send actual Americans in on foot to go find who did this and put us at more risk to do that. And that was like my first realization of like, hey, we're fighting someone that fights by a whole different set of rules. And it's sometimes portrayed on like the major media outlets, but it's not always understood. I think that was like my first big understanding of kind of like what deployments were going to be like, and they kind of really picked up from there.